So I'd like to go over upper and lower GI bleeding. And this one was a little bit more straightforward than my last activity I had you guys do. So it doesn't matter whether you're talking about upper or lower gastrointestinal tract bleeding. There's some general terms and some just generalities I'd like to go over first. Terminology: hematemesis or hematemesis, depending on which way you want to pronounce it, just means throwing up blood. And the kicker here is to know that you're not always talking about a GI source. Um, Understand that if you throw up blood, it's got to be from where your pancreas connects into your duodenum north. So your mouth, your esophagus, your stomach, or the first part of your duodenum. But if you swallow blood, like if you have a bloody nose, or you were coughing up blood from your lungs and you swallowed it, that could actually be thrown up blood as well. So it's not always a GI source of bleeding. Hematochezia, which means gross blood, and that doesn't mean that it's gross to look at it, but you actually see physical red blood, and that's in your stool. So it's usually from your colon and usually from your transverse colon or the colon going across your abdomen, or your descending colon, but it could be from your stomach or your duodenum, or your jejunum or ileum if you're bleeding fast enough. So think of a colonic bleed or an small intestinal or even stomach bleed if it's a really, really fast bleed. Melena, or melena, as they would say, that's a black tarry stool. So that's usually a slow upper GI bleed that's been where blood's been broken down by a little bit of hydrochloric acid or stomach acid. Um, but it can also be a small bowel bleed from your jejunum or ileum, or a colonic bleed if it's a really slow bleed where the blood's just had a chance to get broken down. Coffee ground emesis. That's a slow upper GI bleed. So if you've got something that's been bleeding into your stomach, and the stomach acid has broken it down for a little bit, and then you throw up, a lot of times it'll look like, Folgers coffee when it comes up. So upper GI bleeding is bleeding anywhere between your mouth to the first part of your duodenum or duodenum, where your pancreas connects in. So how do you bleed? So the important thing to remember is that the lining to your anywhere in your GI tract, we call it mucosa, but it's essentially just shiny and wet skin. And that shiny and wet skin is very thin and it's very fragile, and it's lying right over a very rich blood supply. So if anything were to cause that lining to break down for whatever reason, and it would erode far enough to get to the blood supply, it's going to bleed, and it'll bleed into that tube. So it's not really that hard of a thing to think about. It's not that hard to do. So a few things that can cause upper GI bleeding, but not the number one cause. So esophageal varices. So this means really stuffed, full, swollen veins right below the surface in your esophagus, and this is usually somebody that's happens to someone as a complication to cirrhosis of the liver. Gastric cancer. So if you've got a tumor that's growing out in towards the stomach, that is very fragile. It can break off little pieces and bleed, especially exposed to all that acid. A Mallory Weiss tear. So if you've just thrown up hard enough from retching over and over again, your stomach or your esophagus can bleed from just all that intense vomiting. Or a vascular malformation if it's really close to the surface of the lining of like the stomach. Again, easy to get damaged, conceptually easy to do. But the number one cause are ulcers, either gastric ulcers, they're called peptic ulcers, or duodenal ulcers. And if it's in your stomach, you usually get gastritis or inflamed lining of the stomach first. And even those can bleed a little bit, but then they will lead to a full-on ulcer that's completely eroded. And we will pick up there in part 2 in the next video.